his panel, or the panel he will lead, is about international research and collaboration in media education. So, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. I feel like this is going to be like a grand entrance of the panelists because it's empty. So we should have like a smoke machine and a strobe light, and I should really introduce people. And I guess we will do that because nobody is going to come up yet. So
I want a laser light show.
you want a laser light show? Okay, everyone's got their own introduction. So thank you for the introduction, Isabella. My name is Paul Milhailidis. I'm a faculty at Emerson College, which is in downtown Boston. It's a school devoted to media and arts. Oh, and there's Belina behind me. And I'm also director of a global media project on media and global change called the Salzburg Academy. And the project is basically a network of young media innovators and media makers who convene every month in Salzburg. There's about 75 students from 25 countries around the world that come together for a month in Salzburg. And we really try to build the capacity for young people to be actors in their communities, local communities, across borders, across cultures, and across divides. And I think that project has kind of included many of the people here, and I think part of this panel is stemming off the work that we do in Salzburg, because we're really at kind of the intersection of looking at theories of media education and change, but also theories of activism, engagement, and civic agency. And so the panel today is going to be about research and collaboration in media education. And I guess I'll ask the panelists, do you guys mind coming up so this is not awkward anymore and I'm just talking at you? So I will introduce the panelists, but I would just love them to come up and take their seats because, yeah, I wish I had music. Belina, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh,
You're
good,
coming
okay.
clear.
Oh, perfect. Hey, how? Hey. Don't fall off.
I wasn't actually invited to be on the panel. That's the problem. I've just insisted on coming up here.
Yeah, I'm going to do this. We felt bad for Julian. He's put in a lot of hard work, so we figured we'd ask him. So what we'd like to spend a little bit of time today before we transition into the end of the conference is to look at some of the challenges that we face in terms of collaboration in media education projects and media education research, because a few general things that we've been hearing at this conference and that we've been seeing in our own work. We are seeing this word of porous culture come about, and this is not only between the educator versus student as experts, but also in terms of how youth and young citizens imagine themselves as part of communities and identities. The borders for information have disintegrated. Education now is being globalized in some very interesting ways, not in explicit ways, but a lot of the context for how we might approach these things aren't just aren't situated physically alone, but extend across cultures, across borders. And a lot of the work that we aim to do in the media education world has competencies that I think that apply to many of the cultures represented here, but more so for the youth. So. And so I'm going to just go through who the panel are quickly, and then I'd like to have a facilitated discussion with them and with all of you that answers pretty much 4 questions in terms of this. So we're going to look at what we've accomplished so far in collaborative media literacy and media education projects, what we're failing to do, what we need to do, and how we can get there. And so as we answer those questions, first I'm going to give you know who everyone is, but I'll just say their name again. So Rob Williams, he's the president of the Action Coalition for Media Education. Davina Frau-Meggs, who is the head of CLEMI now and also a professor at the Sorbonne Nouvelle. Andrew Byrne from DARE and University of London. Renee Hobbs from the University of Rhode Island in the Media Education Lab, Donna Chu from Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Julia McDowell from Kemp and Bournemouth University. So this is our panel, and on the Skype, till about a minute ago, was Belina Diebru from Fairfield University, and she unfortunately couldn't join us, so she offered to Skype in, and I'm going to try to call her one more time, and then we'll see if this sticks. And so the way I'd like to facilitate this is just to spend a little bit of time asking the panel to respond to a few questions, and then open it up to get your thoughts and your questions for them. And so I want to start with talking about a little bit of framing questions. And so we're thinking about collaborative media education and research. So I don't know if that's going to work. Should we just...
Might be better
just to cut it?
cut the argument.
Yeah, I think so. Okay.
I'll send it.
Okay, thanks. This is multi-modalities right now. You're going to send her an email. I'm cutting it. You tweet about it. You get it on Facebook. You build a game about it, and you speak for her. Yeah. Okay, so I guess the first question to the...
Disconnect that so we stay on my Skype stream.
Okay.
Not because anything bad's going to happen in there.
There we go. Okay. So I guess the way that I'd like to open this up is to first talk about what are some of the main challenges you see. So what I'm hearing over this conference a lot over these last 2 days is that we have a lot of kind of terminological I guess broadness or vagueness somewhat. I see a lot of overlapping notions of it's MIL, it's media education, and to me that seems like it might have some implications for how we could collaborate on projects and research. And I wondered, I don't know if we want to open up with Davina, Renee, and your work and seeing, do you think that that media education research is being hampered or being mitigated at all by some of the terminological vagueness or differences we have across our research fields? So, do you want to start?
Sometimes when media literacy educators get together at international gatherings, we think we understand each other because we use the same terms. Like we might use the term inquiry or project-based learning. And it isn't until we're in a real conversation that we realize that we might be using the same word, but having different meanings associated with it. So that's one kind of confusion that can happen. We can use the same language, think we understand each other, and then misunderstandings emerge once we learn more deeply. The other kind of misunderstanding, the one that, sorry about that. The other kind of misunderstanding is when I say tomato and you say tomato, right? And I used to think those definitional issues were important to reconcile, and now I think it doesn't matter at all.
Okay, can you explain why you think it doesn't matter?
Why it doesn't matter at all is that we're in a transformative time where a new medium is ascending, and just as media education's always been like feeling the blind men and the elephant, right? Trying to feel this enormously complicated thing that has many features and qualities. You feel the tail and you have a very good understanding of it. And your understanding of the elephant is no less valuable than my understanding. I feel the ear. We're going to feel like we misunderstand each other, but it's just that the thing we're trying to apprehend is so much bigger than any one of us can manage. So I don't think we need to be afraid of that or see it as an obstacle. It's a sign that the work that we're doing is important. That it's just that big, that there are so many nuances of it that we use different terms that reflect our understanding.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to add, from the perspective of a media education research section at IMCR, which I helped rebuild because it used to be called media education, it's been very important to add the word research, because for years media education was considered as a practice, and so there's been an important activist perspective here, trying to say that it needs to be research and not just practiced. So, and then when you do that, and you bring people from around the world, like an NGO does, then you realize there's also research schools and perspectives that don't overlap. Actually, they really represent different ways of thinking around the world, and it's a challenge to bring them together and put them at the same level of quality, because different countries will be approaching it, how should I say, at different speeds. And there's dominant research paradigms, most of them coming from the north and coming from the English-speaking world, and all the others, as a result, are secondary somehow, or always have to legitimize themselves in relation to this dominant paradigm. So approaches that are not quantitative, when on the same panel you have them with approaches that are qualitative, they are disqualified. Approaches that are semiotic rather than sociological or applied or pragmatic are disqualified. And so you spend also all your time trying to professionalize both. And that could be the possible advantage of a collaborative, is that both approaches, or all the different approaches, have to become explicit about their implicits. Why we're coming from this perspective, why we're defending notions instead of numbers, why we're on epistemology and philosophy rather than the sociology of action, blah, blah, blah. And that's when it becomes interesting. But it's a very, as a result, it's a very unequal field, and I always have a very hard time defending it compared to audience research or this kind of thing that is very, very established. At the same time, and I agree with René, it does show that it's a field that is very buoyant. I mean, there's lots of things happening, so it's alive.
Right. Does anyone want to come in on that? Because so what I'm taking away from this is that, and what I feel sometimes that happens, and I don't know if anyone else does, as researchers, sometimes these questions. And the research ends up getting almost sucked into different, more dominant disciplines, and then the media literacy or media education field oftentimes ends up kind of on the margins, because that research, like the big research questions, the social science questions, they often end up being positioned in other spaces. And I've seen that as kind of, so where does the media education research then fall? Is it prudent to then try to have your own space? Or is it best just to play within the other fields? And I know that's an old question, but I don't know if you guys want to give some of your thoughts on this. If Julian, if you want to chime in on that.
I've got this special microphone.
Yep. It has a buffer in case you hit your face by accident.
Okay.
And it's not ice cream.
Well, I think then, firstly, just to say, I think one of the strengths of the summit this year is that we have colleagues from what might have hitherto been considered various different camps and locations and methodological approaches and paradigms. And it's almost like we're kind of getting over those boundaries and starting to think more collectively about what it is we actually want to do, because the field has been established for quite a while now. And for me, I think what's come out of so many of the conversations and the presentations has been a either stated or understated desire for a pedagogy which can enable or facilitate some notion of civic engagement and action. And whereas previously that's been kind of tangled up with all kinds of other discourses around media literacy and media education, it's the one for me that seems to be coming across the most often in what people are working with here. And most of what people are presenting is based on research, which is really refreshing. So it's not just what we all think young people should do, that they're not, but what we are actually finding out young people are doing, but actually not doing often in terms of civic engagement. So the kinds of research I think that we should be working on together, and it sounds like people want to work on together now, is that kind of notion of, what kind of a pedagogic rationale do you need for mediated civic engagement? And then the question that we talked about informally throughout the last couple of days is how political is that and how explicit do we need to be about the politics, if there are politics there? Because for me it's a political project, and so many of the conversations we have are actually about corporations and hegemony and the co-option of youth in various neoliberal practices. But we don't really talk about that because the people that fund research and the people that publish research and the people that organise networks often are a little bit reluctant to be so explicit about a political project. So I think I've just rambled on incoherently and not really added much to...
No, I think...
Take what you can from that.
No, I mean, I think that's a really important point. I think we can pick up on that. That does media education research or media literacy research need to have an explicit outcome? Do we need to talk about it in terms of political agency or power and hegemony? Does that give it more of a grounding, or is that dangerous because it might not get us to where we want to go? Does anyone? Yeah.
Sorry to be back. I think I'm the most politically engaged here for media literacy, not to, in the sense that I push for it at the Council of Europe, at the EU, and in governments. But I know that all of you are activists. I think it's true, and it's partly one of the reasons media education is not being legitimized, I would say, because it's too powerful, which is why I use the word dispositif. I'm going to Foucault and his idea of biopouvoir. It's really something that is encompassing too much of society. Which is also why I think it's dangerous at the moment that the word media is being so naturalized in the internet and in the networks, because it is a way of taking the teeth out of it in terms of criticism. I have competition here, it's a plot. But it's true that it is one of the areas where the intricacy with policy making is at the biggest, and an area that touches the politicians per se. For instance, at Clémy, which is in Refoundation, I'll give a quick example because maybe it relates to that. The government wanted to absorb Clémy in its new policy on digital literacy. And it was the local politicians and the rector, which control the academies, there's 30 of them in France, who protested and organized a lobby to maintain Clémy. And when I asked them, well, why did you do that? I didn't even ask you guys, as a director, I didn't even think about you. They said, well, we need the media to do local politics and we want them with us. And when you do events like the Semaine de la Presse, we are very visible in the media, and we're not visible as politicians, as people who are imposing politics. We are visible as citizens, and so we need you, and we'll keep you separate from. So I've learned a lesson that it does touch politics very closely, and it's also why when it is adopted in documents, like in Morocco or in Tunisia or whatever, it's never applied. Which is why I insisted in my presentation between the principles. They have to be there, and in lots of countries they are. But in terms of implementation, there's always a lot of people who make sure it doesn't happen. So it's a very twisted thing. But I think it's because there's really power there. And you're empowering people who are not yet citizens. They don't vote yet.
Right. Andrew?
Button. Yes, a sort of interesting mixture of issues emerging, aren't there? I mean, I think probably most people here would agree that the politics of media education and media literacy are paramount, but how that's expressed is kind of difficult. I think we'd all accept that that's the bit of criticality, whatever we mean by criticality. We had an interesting discussion about this yesterday in one of the sessions, and it's one of the weasel words in media education that's difficult to pin down and define. And while I kind of share some of Renée's kind of exasperation at these endless sort of discussions about concepts, we have to keep worrying away, I guess, at that one. But whatever criticality means, it clearly means some kind of critical purchase on the politics of representation, for example, which is at the center of the media education project. And I think, as Davina says, one of the things that politicians tend to be nervous about. For that reason, it seems to me that we always have to have a twin strategy. We have to pursue that, but we also have to think, well, how do we make natural alliances in curriculum location? And this is true across Europe, it's true across the world, with partners who are likely to get us off the hook a little bit with the politicians. I mean, the most common alliance across Europe, and I think probably internationally, is with literacy programs, mother tongue education. And it's a good home for us because it's a core subject area. Every country has to have it in some way or another. And there's then a kind of rather difficult set of debates about cultural values in national literatures, for example, and the rather different cultural values in the popular cultural forms of the media. But I think, as my example of making video games of Shakespeare is intended to demonstrate, there are ways of kind of bridging those gaps and winning a kind of alibi for our project, while at the same time surreptitiously inserting our kind of political intentions. So that's one thing. Just very quickly, in terms of research paradigms, I think we do need the kind of big numbers, and we do need the qualitative projects. We need the latter to show in detail, in kind of glowing detail, what these projects can look like with real teenagers in real classrooms. But we also need to know the numbers. I get worried about endless kind of media conferences I've been to where everybody shows their pet project, and I'm the worst offender. We all show our pet projects, and we feel very celebratory about them, or we love them, and they show what's possible. And then we come up against the hard facts of how many kids get to do this as a kind of entitlement. The recent survey we did with the BFI for film education across Europe shows that there is no entitlement of that kind anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the world nationally. I think Hungary comes closest with a mandatory year at primary school and secondary school for media education, but nobody delivers it 100%, and that's one way or another what we should aim for. And mother tongue programs are the easiest way of doing it. The DARE project is to try and think how we can find alliances with the arts, with arts education, another important, though often also marginalised area, which is the danger. But again, it shows that we can make an alliance between our projects in popular culture and the heritage culture projects that are typical of the arts world, and actually of the film education world as well, increasingly. So we can build these bridges. One final anecdote I was reminded of. I agree with Julian that civic participation is a worthy aim and one of the models that we should pursue. But I think there are other ones. There's almost an opposite one. I had a student once from the States who was doing a PhD project on youth media projects. And her anxiety was that those projects and the funders behind them tended to kind of enforce worthy civic participation projects when that wasn't necessarily what the kids wanted to do. And her example was a Native American girl, and the pressure was on her. Nobody was explicit about the pressure. It was felt it all came from the kids to make a film about the culture of her tribe. And she wanted to make a film about skateboarding. So sometimes there are cultural preoccupations of kids that are at odds with our sort of adult concerns about the teleological trajectory of media education towards future citizenship. But again, in my familiar have your cake and eat it philosophy, I think we can have the best of both of these.
Well, yeah, do you want to follow?
I just wanted to weigh in. I think about all of the kids, or if we think about all the kids that we work with, all ages over the years, it seems to me that kids are most motivated to learn and to really delve into media education when there's some kind of cause involved that they identify with. And the cause could be like, I like skateboarding, and so I'm gonna advocate for a skateboard park in my town, or whatever. And the word civics, I agree with you, sometimes is easily co-opted, right? So maybe to think about sort of cause-driven media education in the sense that we want a kid in our media education classroom to get excited about something beyond him or herself that is of value to them. Right. And then really sort of push on that as part of the media education sort of approach. And I think we can all probably think of examples of kids who have done this. Right. Again, all ages, and been successful at it, perhaps.
Right. And I think there's a lot that was just said in there, but I think one of the important things that we've been talking about these last couple of days is that the idea of the civic engagement is embedded in the notion of acting, and that a lot of times we talk about the idea of just creating and making, but what does that mean in the context of actually that being an action? So the content of what is civic and what is not might not be as important as just defining that notion of being an actor. So whether it's skateboarding that becomes the point of advocacy, that's a direction that they're moving in. And so that should be tied into creation. But I just wanted to get back to this idea before we talk. So one thing I'm really interested in before the questions is the idea about what type of research is needed to to provide some substance and some ideas to move beyond just the idea that we're all, what was it, not the pony show, I forget your, pet projects, yeah. So we carry these pet projects around. So part of the idea of Renee's not, what I'm interested in about Renee's not worrying so much about terminology anymore is, so when I take your idea about getting this media literacy to everybody, I think depending on how that terminology works, you could argue that you have 3 million kids getting media literacy or that you have 1,000, I imagine. And I think that's where the definitional vagueness becomes, to me, an interesting concept. Like, if we don't worry about the terminology, then I imagine teachers doing a lot of things might say they are part of this literacy or this education space. And I wonder if that space becomes too diffuse if we don't have, and this is where I think research really becomes important. So I didn't know if anyone wanted to try to tackle that one of, that idea that we want everyone to have it, but what does that mean?
Can I just come back quickly on that?
Sure.
I mean, I think that's right. We've got to be fairly precise about the definition. Otherwise, we get sucked into some worrying claims. I mean, a recent report on media education in Europe suggested, it tried to kind of quantify how many people were participating in each country, and I think the English figure came out at something like 80%, and it completely isn't 80%. I mean, we have a long and proud tradition, but it really isn't that. And the reason why it came out so high is because they were including ICT education. Well, every kid in the UK does computer studies, and that was being included in the definition. Well, whatever we are, we're not ICT education, nor are we media across the curriculum. You know, as my old colleague David Buckingham always used to say, you know, we're about learning about the media, not learning through the media, and that seems to me also to be a critical distinction. So we're not ICT, and we're not EdTech, and we're not e-learning, and we're not media, learning through media, I would argue.
I'm not sure about that.
Turn your microphone on, Renee.
I'm just being provocative, but I do believe it.
Go ahead, Donna, do you want to add?
Yes, I was surprised when I was invited on this panel because in Hong Kong there is no media education in the curriculum. And if you ask me about the relationship between practices and research, I think we need to have at least some practices in order to be research. And in Hong Kong there are not many practices, and if there are, people don't really recognize that they are doing media literacy. And like, for example, there are media organizations in Hong Kong which actively promote the idea of learning about media. So they are commercial enterprises, and it is very interesting, and they have been doing it for more than 10 years. And the public broadcaster in Hong Kong, RTHK, they have been doing a media simulation experience every year. So they will create a scenario in which young people can join to experience what it's like to be covering a news. And they will be joining in a competition. But they don't really frame it as media literacy. But to me, it is a form of media literacy. And so I think there are people doing this in Hong Kong, but not really calling this. And so for me, media education is very much marginalized in Asia, in Hong Kong at least. And I found it very hard to find people who speak the same language with me. So although I don't really know why being so in that stage, Hong Kong is not particularly advanced here. I'm here. I'm still very happy to join you for the discussion. But one thing I want to ask is about the politics as well. And if you can see that in the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, and also 2 years ago when there were a group of young people who took to the street to protest against the introduction of national education. They were very young kids. The leader was 15 years old by then, and he just turned 18 last month. So his name is Joshua Wong, and he was on the cover of Time magazine just a few weeks back. And I know someone is doing a research about this kind of media activism and youth. And the exact question this person asked was, why is he so media literate? Because like this Mr. Joshua Wong, who is only 18 years old, he managed his Facebook account so well. So whatever he says, sensible or non-sensible, there are so many likes. And so it seems to many people, researchers, that he is almost like a electro-born communicator who knows all the assess, analyze, evaluate, and all those things. And so he becomes a case study, and I know a few people are working to uncover the mysteries behind this. And to be, when we take a step back, we might realize that actually many young people are already very well versed with these skills. So what do we really mean when we want to educate them? Of course, I agree that the ethical dimension is very important, but what exactly will these be? So these are my questions that I bring here. Yeah.
So Donna's point is a very nice counterpoint to yours. As long as we academics sit around and pronounce media literacy is not e-learning, it's not digital literacy, it's not this, it's not that, as long as we cling to our little pet ideologies, we're going to ignore the complex reality. We're going to create situations where Donna says there is no media literacy in Asia. That's wrong. Of course there is. It's just that the hierarchies that the academics set up exclude perspectives that don't fit those narrow paradigms. So I'm okay with blurry, big tent realities, messy as it is, because I think we learn more by looking at the world kind of a-theoretically almost. Looking at the world and saying, what is going on there, and not how does it fit my theory.
And oh, by the way, the college kids in Hong Kong right now are showing us how it's done in terms of cause and advocacy, aren't they? Right? You could grant a PhD degree in the study of the umbrella movement. Don and I were talking about this yesterday. I was in Hong Kong 10 days ago, happened to be there, never been, at the end of a trip, and I went down to the tent city to Occupy Central, and I spent 2 hours just walking around with my media professor goggles on, and I thought to myself, how did these Hong Kong kids learn how to do all this? I mean, they were using every sort of form of media in the book, right? And I went to the study tent, and I sat down with a young woman who studies at Hong Kong University, and I asked her, what's going on here? And this is what she said to me. She said, we study democracy. We learn about democracy in our schools here, but we don't have democracy in Hong Kong. That's why we're here. And I thought to myself, maybe the problem is that we're too top-down ourselves about this, and what we need to do is honor that, again, that cause-oriented focus of our kids.
It's good, it's on.
I think you should say a little bit about the Salzburg work, because when I visited, what struck me there was you've got the combination of the research, the focus on the action, but what's really interesting is that the media is a conduit for the action. So, I'm not going to give you the answer to my own question, but by doing what they do, they go into a critical mode around media, but that's not the starting point.
That makes sense. I mean, I will. So I can definitely talk about that in a second. I want to hear what Davina has to say quickly, but I also do. So part of this discussion and what I don't want to happen before we have questions is, I think that this narrative of we do, we don't is why I think we wanted to put together a panel on research. And because I really think there has to be, it seems like a lot of times we live in the anecdotal space of like, it is because this happens, it's not. So I'm really interested in the idea of what research needs to be done so that we don't just say that Hong Kong, that the umbrella movement is this thing because there's kids on Facebook and there's a civic movement there, Occupy. These things, I mean, those are good examples, but they should not be blanket statements for or against the work that we're doing. So, and that's, I think, one way that media education has to get legitimated in your fields, in all of our fields, is to point to real evidence of strong assessment, strong evaluation. And it can be quantitative, it can be qualitative, they can be pet projects, but that building up that base is I think really important, and especially in the context of this group here, because it's really about finding ways to continue to advocate and substantiate the work that we all do. And I think you can still show a lot of great projects, but without the real kind of the evidence that there's efficacy there at the end, I think you continue to fall back onto these claims, at least personally. So I don't know if there was a question in there, but that was just a thought I had. Did you want to?
Well, you hit one of our paradoxes from day one as researchers in media education. We are against traditional evaluation because in the kind of pedagogies that we do in media education, it's exactly not about giving a grade, exactly not about saying it's happening now and there's no results later, etc. So if I'd say if there's an area where we have to work a lot, because we mention it often but we haven't gone into it seriously, is how do we evaluate differently these projects, which is why I was saying, collaborative instead of individual, long-term instead of short-term, and then you're going to see it much later. It so happens I have an Erasmus Mundus student who is finishing her dissertation defending her dissertation next December about the movement Occupied. And she's exactly in that kind of process of how do we evaluate it. The way she did it was by comparing its different stages in different countries and seeing how the movement was inspired by other people, and etc. And so there was an accumulation, but it's one way. But we don't know about evaluation, and maybe we should actually even drop it. The problem is if we drop it, we don't get funding. So the other thing I wanted to say is that we should not underestimate what the digital is doing to us as researchers and what it's doing to media. Because as media education researchers, we used to keep media at a distance so that we could look at them critically. And media were traditionally outside the classroom. We would go or invite them in a very narrowly controlled way, a clipping, a newspaper, one journalist invited, etc. Today, the media are in the classroom. Arguably, each kid is a media whatever. And this is what we should be preoccupied about, is that this has an impact on everything we do, the research we do, the teaching we do, etc. And we are not controlling that. We were talking about the myth of being authors, all being creative because of having media. I think we are at a lower level, and we should be modest about it. We are just at the expressive level, just each kid is capable of expressing himself or herself any which way these days and publishing the goddamn thing. And we are also supposed to watch this and train them about this. And this is what we're seeing with the Hong Kong kids. They're expressing themselves. I'm not even sure they are at a level of highly super organized politics. And actually they probably would say, we certainly don't want the politics of parties. We know that civic agency is not about party engagement. That's one clear thing among the things they do. So, but we are underestimating really how the digital is impacting our way of researching and augmenting it, adding a lot to what we can do.
So Davina, I hear you saying that the loss of critical distance that's resulting from the rise of digital media and everyone becoming an author actually creates a new demand for protectionist approaches to media literacy, because the only antidote to the loss of critical distance is to get some distance. So I think of our friend Tiffany Schlein, who is adamant about maintaining her media Shabbat. Every week, she and her family unplugs and has a media-free day, in part in order to be reminded about the loss of critical distance that comes from hypermediation. It's possible that our concerns about privacy and about who can take photos and share photos of whom in what context is actually a healthy kind of protectionism that might actually reinvigorate this issue of balance. It might be that preschool teachers not wanting to use tablets and not wanting to have media in the preschool is actually a healthy way to create families that balance screen media life with the rest of life. So perhaps the loss of critical distance demands a new kind of protectionist approach to media literacy.
I didn't say that.
So
Just to say, I've got to go. Well, apologies for leaping off. We've got to go and run a video game workshop with the youth workshop group.
last words for this?
No, I'll just leave the issues hanging. I think it's a healthy debate, and I look forward to hearing what everyone says about it. Yeah.
I still want to get back to, and I know about this work, but it's coming on now. There we go. So, thanks, Andrew. He is going to do a workshop with the youth now. So that wasn't an excuse and a cop-out just to leave the panel. So I did want to give us some time. I know we have about 10, 15 minutes left, but I still don't know if the question of evaluation, so this idea of evaluation or assessment, and I know I was going to ask you, Renee, because you do a lot of this type of work. If you still think that's, is in your experience, is that something that's growing or being legitimated in our field? Do you see more of it now? Is the quality increasing? What's your general thought on where we stand as evaluators of our
In terms
content?
of global research, I get the next talk, so I'm not going to spoil my talk by answering that question.
Give us a teaser.
But I do want to talk about something that you and I participated in that I thought has robust possibilities for researchers, and that was a most curious and strange experience that I had last year doing a teacher education program in Lebanon. So I had the opportunity to spend one whole day with university faculty and high school faculty and do a teacher education program. And it was simultaneously translated, right, into Arabic. And it was absolutely mind-blowing. And I feel like, for me, the most sort of powerful ahas are this place of complexity where teachers are about the nature of authority. Media literacy's most radical possibility is to reshape relationships between teachers and students so that authority is more equitably distributed. But teachers really value their authority.
Right.
And authority is actually all we have, really. That's it. Other than that, we're useless, right? So what I think is really interesting is about how do we create learning spaces for teachers to discover what new kinds of learning happens when you let go of the lecture, when you let go of the transmission model, when you step off the stage, when you replace that form of authority, the knowledge transmission authority, with another kind of authority. And is that moral authority? Is that social authority? Is that relational authority? I think that's a place of great possibility for media literacy research, and I think it's almost like research we need to do about ourselves. Like it's autoethnography. It's research we have to do about our own stance and positionality, about the authority structures that we work in that maintain us as part of the problem.
Right. I mean, that's very interesting. Actually, I don't want to answer. I think I'm going to ask the audience. I mean, does anyone in this room want to comment on that or have a question on that? Yeah. Hold on.
I just have a small comment on what Renee just said. I usually start, if I'm teaching certainly first year undergraduates, I would usually begin by reminding them that nothing I'm going to tell them in the entire course of the time I'm teaching them will in fact be true.
That's a way
Could you repeat that because of the jackhammer?
We can't hear you, Rob. The jackhammer.
We can't hear you, Paul.
The first thing that she says to her classes is that nothing that she tells them is true. Which is, I mean, I think which is starting to get at Renee's question, but I'm not sure if that still removes us from that position of authority.
Can I jump in here real quick? Is it true that when we make a claim on research, when we claim to be doing research, doesn't that put us automatically in kind of an authority position in the sense that we are setting ourselves up to collect the data and become the expert? And if that's true, that definition of research, then perhaps that's sort of antithetical to this whole project, right? I mean, back to Renee's and Davina's points here.
Right. This reminds me, Julie. It reminds me of the talk we had this morning. But I think this goes to the idea of, are you everything, are you nothing? And there has to be some kind of conceptual grounding for this work to be done. But Julie?
I'm Julie Frechette from Worcester State, and I've written on some of these topics before, but I'm really excited that we're going back to questions of pedagogy, because I think in as much as we don't want to lose the word media in digital media literacy, I think it's also important for us to go back to critical pedagogy. And so many people did this many years ago very well, and I had the luxury of working with Augusto Boal, who did Theater of the Oppressed. And we learned how important it was to do that, stepping back and thinking about not giving up our claims to authority in terms of our intellectual knowledge and ability to offer something to these students. Otherwise, why would we be doing what we're doing? But to facilitate learning. And I go back also to Judith Williamson from the British Film Institute, who years ago really came up with a very clever way of saying in her article, how do you respond to girl number 21 in like a large lecture classroom? She talked about making sure that transformational modes of learning mean that you have the students look at the issues that matter most to them. And I think, Davina, you talked about how this often comes from their own personal locations, personal issues in their neighborhoods and their families, and that's really exciting. So that we're not saying, look at this, what's wrong with this perspective, and impose our own ideological takes, but get them to look at ideologies through their own lenses after we give them structural tools in which to do so. So we shouldn't avoid talking about power and showing them ways that we've conceptualized it and provide those case studies and examples, but then let them decide for themselves, how will they look at these things in their own lives, in their own worlds.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to that one? Yeah.
That's the meaning of my UNESCO chair. You're all welcome to join. No, I'm kidding, but I had to create a word for it in English, but also in French. And in English, I've called it forwardance, which means being able to use the affordances of media to move forward, if you see what I mean. And I was building on a prior report by Jacques Delors, who wrote for UNESCO a report on education in 1996 called Education, A Treasure is Hidden Within It. And this is where he put forward the idea that there were 4 pillars in education. Learning to learn, of course, learning to be, learning to do, and learning to live together, from which we've derived the competences, being able to, etc., etc. So I've added a fifth one with this idea of learning to become. Because I'm afraid in a pre-digital world, we also have to be critical about it, though we come from it. We fossilized ourselves in a lot of beliefs that we stopped looking again from a different lens. And so for me, savoir devenir is that, is looking at things from a different lens and allowing time and reorientation and feedback and revision to come in. And we know cognitively that revision is extremely important, but it takes different rhythms for people, which is why it breaks down the categories, the traditional categories of evaluation on a year-per-year basis. You have to allow for this to be much more flexible, or at least for people to reevaluate that themselves over time. Amartya Sen, who speaks about development, says the same thing, and it goes back to why you end up having civic agency. And I believe in the same thing as he does. He says you can't, he comes from a development perspective, the development of a person cannot be done just by making sure that their survival needs are taken into account. So giving underdeveloped countries food looks like helping them and looks like survival, but they'll never become autonomous. They will keep on the dependency loop that way. So as long as you build that, but also self-esteem, which is about self-actualization, which is about revision, which is about working with others, which is about what I call the aesthetics of our own life, you are not going to create people who are engaged and can take advantage of their life and the affordances of life. You become a civic agent once you have self-esteem, which is where expressive media are important, because once you control your self-esteem or feel you're in control of it, you will express yourself. And as soon as you express yourself in the public domain, you are being political. Even if it's to say, I like skateboarding. In a culture where there's no skateboarding, it becomes extremely dangerous sometimes. So, so we have to build those two things. We have to build the self-esteem of students, and media education is particularly good at that because it's a show and tell in school systems that usually are just about rote.
There's an expression, actually, I think comes from Kendall McDougall here, which is pedagogy of the inexpert, pedagogy of the inexpert. And I found this incredibly powerful for me, moving from a practitioner into teaching, moving to space in which I absolutely felt abandoned in one way and lost. And then in another way, as a practitioner, I felt I had something to say here. And a lot of the thought that's emerging here feels that there's a tension between this, like I've got to know all this stuff and letting go of it. And maybe I could ask Julian to sort of talk against this pedagogy of the expert thought, because it comes partly from him.
And I'm torn between several competing imperatives. One is that the next session starts in 55 seconds. So with my conference organiser hat on, I'm thinking this has got to be quick. Secondly, Alex, who's there, kind of coined the term, and I probably stole it, it's fair to say. Or at least we worked on it together, but I talk about it more than her, so I'm going to pass it to Alex. Alex is going to talk about it in the next session. The pedagogy of the inexpert and other things we talked about around porosity. I mean, my view would be we need to do research which actually, whether or not we think it's politically well-intentioned or how it resides within all these fault lines, I think the thing that's missing with our community of practice is there hasn't been that much research done which actually just shares what pedagogic strategies worked in order to blur those boundaries between teacher and student. Compared to other disciplines in educational research, we haven't done very much to say, actually, whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, or whether we can claim that much about it or not, this is the pedagogic strategy that led to these kinds of results in terms of blurring those boundaries between expert and inexpert. And I think that would, for me, that would be the next stage.
Right. So I think just to wrap this up so Alex has the popular talk next after this because she's going to answer that question. But I think what matters here, and I hear listening to all this and trying to kind of sum up is that, perhaps these discussions, like leaving spaces like this, it's almost more helpful to come out with some of the vagueness and the different approaches that we see here. And that, to me, the notion, like Julian said, there's not enough research. I imagine there's a lot of research looking at teacher-student engagement, expert and inexpert, but maybe not specifically aligned with the media education approaches. But I imagine in the education world, people have looked at those relationships. So I think, for me, it's important that we continue to find spaces to join and express, and even come together in larger venues so that we can continue to build consensus around what we agree on and what we don't agree on. And I think that's, instead of trying to define terminology, we start to see the concentric circles overlap and come apart. And so can you guys please thank them for their participation on this panel? Okay. And you're all, and you're already late for your next session, so hurry up.